when fiscal matters a lot more than monetary policy, and it shapes what they can do with monetary policy. Basically, monetary policy becomes they're less independent, less able to control what they want to do because the fiscal side is such an ongoing issue for them. And the way I kind of characterize that is the difference between the 70s and the 40s. So those are both inflationary decades. When people think of inflation, they always think of the 70s, but the 40s were on average equally inflationary. And in the 70s, most of the money creation was from bank lending, right? So that was not in any way fiscal dominance. Even though we were running significant fiscal deficits, that was the smaller component. A lot of it was bank lending. So you had a very high money multiplier. You had kind of record sustained issuance of bank loans, large because you had baby boomers entering the home buying years, for example, the kind of peak credit formation years. And so you had the surge in bank loans, surge in corporate bond issuance. A lot of this was private sector driven. Um, and when they wanted to slow that down, because there's all this new money being created from fractional reserve lending, by raising interest rates, they could obviously harm borrowers. They could slow that process down pretty significantly. And even though that did increase federal interest expense, because federal debt to GDP was low, like 30%, it doesn't increase interest expense from the public side as fast as it slows down the private sector. When you go back to the 40s, it was a very different environment because most of the money creation in that era was not from bank lending, it was not from corporate bond issuance, it was from large fiscal deficits. Um, and so you had large monetized fiscal deficits. The central bank and the commercial banking system had to buy most of the bonds. So you got that money multiplier effect, but it was very fiscal driven. And the problem is when you have 100% debt to GDP, if you were to raise interest rates, the interest expense that you generate on the public side would be bigger than the amount of reduction you have on the private sector side.
In a recent analysis by Lyn Alden, a concerning trend emerges in the US economy. With fiscal policy exerting more influence than monetary policy, the balance of power is shifting. Alden points out that while the 70s are often associated with inflation, the 40s were equally inflationary, driven by large fiscal deficits. Notably, the current debt-to-GDP ratio has surpassed 100%, reaching levels where interest rate hikes could exacerbate fiscal challenges. Alden warns that the effectiveness of traditional monetary policy tools is waning, with fiscal dominance becoming a significant concern.
And so that's why public debts matter, because eventually, if debts get high enough, you go through the looking glass where higher rates no longer have that kind of firm decelerator aspect that they do in kind of lower public debt environments. And instead it's either more mixed, or in some cases, if it's really imbalanced, it can be an outright accelerator where the additions to fiscal deficits, which are stimulatory, because all that interest expense, all that spending is someone else's income, that can overweight or overshadow what's happening in the private sector side. And I think we're kind of experiencing that to a certain degree, where we're not at the point where it completely overshadows it, but they're roughly on similar magnitudes now. And so you have a much more muted effect from monetary policy than you would have in the 70s compared to fiscal policy. I think obfuscation is a kind of a key method there. And so when we go back to say 2019, for example, when the repo rate spike happened, you kind of describe it in financial jargon. You say, look, there's a repo problem. And for people that were kind of paying attention, including Luke, about looking at, like the supply over issuance of T-bills versus, reserves and other kind of sources of liquidity, a lot of people were pointing out that they're going to have to start buying T-bills. And then they had to start buying T-bills, and it's like, well, why are you buying T-bills when you said you were going to be tightening, right? And you said you're going to be shrinking the balance sheet. Um, and they never say, look, we have to kind of monetize fiscal deficits a little bit here. That's not how you phrase it. You phrase it as put it. You're it's not QE. It's just and so I think we'll probably see things like that. I mean, for example, fiscal dominance would be less inflationary if it imploded the private sector. So, for example, by raising rates so quickly, they blew out interest expense, but they also killed some of the banks. But when those banks started to fail, instead of letting deposits that are uninsured go bust, they bail out the deposits, and so they kind of soften what happens on the private sector while putting the gas on the public side, and that's where you get fiscal dominance being more inflationary. So it could include things like SLR rules changes, kind of financial jargon that helps banks hold more treasuries, which is also basically what they did in the 1940s. It wasn't just the Fed monetizing all the treasuries; it was other pools of capital, including banks. And banks, because they have fractional reserve, policies, that they can hold quite a bit of treasuries depending on regulations around them. Especially if those treasuries are shorter term. And so there's all manner of things they can do. Even things like stable coins are now a new source of treasuries that they can kind of just push out there. From the top level, countries are often trying to de-dollarize now around the margins, whereas the people are often not trying to de-dollarize. You don't see, if you go to the currency markets in Cairo, it's dollars. It's not won. It's not yen. It's not everything else. It's dollars. Um, and so in a lot of these different countries, stable coins have over 99% of the market share. Is dollars, not other currencies. Um, and so that's basically a new source of demand for T bills. So I think there's a bunch of little levers they can pull to kind of put treasuries in a lot of different places. And I think that's probably going to be the name of the game for quite a while.
Continuing the discussion, Lyn delves deeper into the historical context of fiscal challenges in the US economy, highlighting parallels with past periods of concern. Drawing attention to the debt and deficit debates of the 80s and 90s, Alden underscores the current shift in sentiment regarding fiscal matters. Despite previous dismissals of debt concerns, indicators now suggest a something bad coming, with potential implications for investors. Alden suggests that since around 2019, the US has been flirting with a new era where fiscal policy plays a more dominant role, given the lack of the historical offset provided by falling interest rates. This scenario prompts Alden to re-evaluate her asset allocation into favoring assets like gold and Bitcoin rather than treasury bonds.
So I have a view on timing. I agree with that. And I've pointed out in some of my newsletters the concerns people had in the 80s and early 90s around the debt levels. So for example, the famous debt clock went up in, like, what was it, 1988 or 89, and then Ross Perot ran the most successful independent presidential campaign in the early 90s, largely based on debt and deficit. That was kind of a main issue of his, and so that was like peak zeitgeist of that this matters. And if you look at the chart of interest expense as a percentage of GDP, that was peak interest expense because even though federal debt was still fairly low, they had ultra high interest rates, and therefore they had they looked like they had a spiral starting. Now they had the fall of the Soviet Union, they had the opening up of China to the world, and then they had this kind of 30-year stretch of major globalization, interest rates falling from double digits all the way down to basically zero. And so, if I would describe the fiscal problem in one kind of frame, it would be, we've had 40 years of rising debt to GDP, but it's been offset by 40 years of falling interest rates until we hit zero. And so if we just go, sideways now, let alone up, but if we just go sideways now, then we no longer have that offset of interest rates compared to the debt. And a lot of this is locked in, and now we're well over, like 100% debt to GDP. And so I think it's almost ironic. I think basically because so many people freaked out in the 80s and 90s around the debt and deficit, that they, like, a lot of analysts then say, okay, that's kind of like they were way too premature. The lessons we learned is that debts and deficits don't matter. That's how a lot of people took that, right? They say, look, those people were wrong. Yeah, and I think the pendulum has swung so far that now people are in the mindset that debts and deficits don't really matter, and it's starting to matter. And so, for example, we've had the longest period of the conference board leading indicator being like in recession territory, and yet not having a official declared recession. We've had, PMIs went down. Normally, bond yields go down when that happens. Instead, bond yields went up. And as Luke pointed out, that chart, gold and real rates diverging. The fact that the Federal Reserve had to come in and stop reducing their balance sheet in 2019 while there's still an economic expansion. Um, these are all kind of things that start happening, and it's not like one Boolean outcome. Like, now we go from not in fiscal dominance to permanently in fiscal dominance. But over the past, call it 5 years, there's been a number of pretty clear indicators that various signs of fiscal dominance and EM-like characteristics in the U.S. are building. And so I don't think it's a matter of like, okay, here like 2028 is like the, date that we're going to enter fiscal dominance. My view is basically ever since 2019 or so, we've roughly been flirting with it. That's fiscal is now a bigger factor than it normally is, and we don't have that 40-year offset in lower interest rates to offset that. And if somehow, let's say if AI comes and just completely gives us this massive disinflationary force and just kind of holds down. They're able to have low interest rates despite fairly high money supply growth. Well, then I still want to be in kind of the same assets that I'm in anyway, which I'd rather be in gold and Bitcoin than treasury bonds, for example, in that environment.
Today, we dove into a fascinating analysis by Lyn Alden, exploring the intricate relationship between fiscal and monetary policy in the US economy. Alden highlighted historical parallels and discussed the implications of fiscal dominance on monetary policy effectiveness. From the challenges of the 70s to the debt debates of the 80s and 90s, Alden painted a comprehensive picture of the evolving economic landscape. As we navigate these complexities, Alden's insights urge us to reconsider traditional asset allocation strategies, favoring assets like gold and Bitcoin. Thank you for tuning in.